Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As it's been stated, I'll be presenting our research topic on biodiversity conceptualization and utilization in peri-urban communities, a case study of Inanda and Bofulstraat. Just to give a brief introduction of the presentation, I'll be starting with the introduction, the aims and objectives of the research study, the methodological approach, the case studies themselves, and some results. Before I can actually get into the actual research project, I'd just like to highlight that this research forms part of the greater scheme of the KwaZulu-Natal Sandstone South Research Program, which is an initiative between the eThekwini municipality and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And amongst the goals is to promote this whole transdisciplinary research, where we're trying to get researchers and people who are in practice in conservation to actually talk to one another and come up with ways where we can actually effectively conserve the threatened biodiversity, especially the KZN SS, while at the same time trying to ensure some form of community engagement and understanding of these communities that we work with. When we're looking at biodiversity conceptualization, the beginning step is to actually figure out what are the perceptions that are held within these communities. These will include their levels of awareness and attitudes towards biodiversity, where communities can see themselves as separate from the biodiversity, as part of the biodiversity, or as stewards of biodiversity. Collectively, perceptions can be a social barrier to conservation, as negative attitudes towards conservation, especially given the history of conservation in a Southern African context, where conservation was often used as a guise for forced removals of black communities. We need to change the perceptions of communities where conservation and conservation agencies are no longer seen as this negative force, but more as partners of trying to protect and conserve the environment. We also need to understand what are the utilization and consumption patterns within these communities that we are involved with. And when we're looking at the utilization, not looking simply at the extraction of natural resources, but rather what are the motivations behind the utilization. And these motivations could include utilization to meet basic needs, to satisfy wants, or the utilization of ecology for cultural and traditional practices. In terms of conservation, as I stated, if we do not change or address the perceptions that communities have to conservation, we can have a barrier and a challenge in actually engaging with these communities. And also, what is very important that we need to actually disseminate the biological importance of conservation, and in the hopes that if we can bridge this gap or bring across the knowledge of the biological importance of conservation, we may better shape conservation perceptions within communities and alter the utilization patterns in line with conservation goals. Also, when dealing with conservation, we also see that we need to take into consideration the ecosystem goods and services that these communities use. And these goods and services can be divided into tangible and direct uses and values that they derive from the ecosystem, such as water and food. And the more difficult ones to measure are the more intangible benefits, such as aesthetic value, cultural attachment, and cultural heritage that these communities have in the biodiversity or ecology that surrounds them. In the mix of all of this, of trying to understand biodiversity conceptualization and conservation, we do face contemporary challenges such as climate change, which not only poses a threat to biodiversity, it also increases the vulnerability of these communities, which are heavily reliant on the natural resources which surround them, thus decreasing the adaptive capacity in the time of climate change. Also, given the change since 1994, we've seen conservation practices have had now a dual role of not only attaining ecological goals, but also ensuring some form of socio-economic development. We do find now that our conservation and management practices, especially for environmental planning and management, need to take into consideration both ecological goals and socio-economic goals. Just to give a brief outline of the aim and objectives of the research, was to examine how utilization and perception of ecology influences biodiversity conservation and participation in mitigation programs within low-income communities. For the sake of today's presentation, we'll only be looking at conservation practices that have been occurring in Inanda Mountain. The objectives were as follows: to examine community perceptions and attitudes towards biodiversity and conservation, to examine community usage of ecosystem goods and services, and to examine community responses to biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. The methodological approach of the research study, which was adopted, was a mixed method approach using both qualitative and quantitative techniques. There was a purposive selection of the case studies, with Nanda Mountain being selected because it's in close proximity to the KwaZulu-Natal sandstone Southveld, and Buffalo's Tribe being selected due to it being seen as a flagship of community participation with regards to the reforestation project that involves the adjacent communities at the landfill site. In collecting the data, surveys were used and were randomly administered, and focus group discussions are planned to be conducted using ranking matrices and participatory mapping. We also had some transit walks in the fear of being labelled as researchers who simply sit in their ivory towers and making assumptions of communities rather than actually being in the community and being able to do some form of assumptions or have an idea of what is actually going on in these communities. And data was analyzed using the statistical package for social sciences. This is Nanda Mountain in relation to it's a mini municipality, and then when blown up, this is now the area where we've done our data collection. Here in the corner, in red, I don't know if anybody can see, that's where the settlement is. And as we can see, the dominant land uses were grasslands and forests. Moving on to some results. Looking at the socio-demographic profile of the community, we found that 44% of the community comprised of males, with 56% being females, thus showing that at least both genders were equally represented within the research study. In terms of the age average, it was at 41.5 years, with a range of 18 to 88 years. In terms of the employment status, what was very shocking and alarming was the rate of unemployment at 61%, with only 27% of the respondents actually having some form of employment. With regards to the level of education, only 56% of community members had actually obtained some form of secondary schooling, and we see here that only 4% have had some form of higher education training where they've obtained either a certificate or a degree or a diploma. In terms of the sources of household income, yet again, only 33% of respondents had said that there is some form of income to the household. And then what we find is that there is a majority, collectively there's a significant proportion of them that rely on some form of welfare state funding, thus further entrenching the socio-economic status of these communities being low-income areas. In terms of the biodiversity conceptualization, few of the respondents were actually aware of the scientific and English term biodiversity. However, when we further probed and actually engaged the community members, we realized that there are isiZulu and isiXhosa alternatives, which were Ezemvelo and Indalo, thus showing that when we're actually engaging with these communities, these would be the most preferable words to use to actually get some form of understanding and start or establish some form of communication with regards to biodiversity. When we further probed the conceptualization of biodiversity, community members related the conceptualized biodiversity as being forests, with very small amounts actually seeing it as some form of religious site. And even though that we see that there was a lack of awareness of the terminology or the term biodiversity, 99% of the respondents were aware that the surrounding ecology actually did comprise of different tree and plant species. But despite this ability to conceptualize biodiversity, community members themselves, as much as 75% of the respondents had stated that they lack the scientific knowledge regarding the biodiversity, thus highlighting a vacuum of education that needs to be filled. In terms of the utilization, 100% of respondents said they do utilize the surrounding biodiversity, with the frequency ranging from 74% of them using it daily, 18% weekly, and 8% saying they use it seldom. Collectively, the environmental goods and services were primarily used to gather resources and for agricultural purposes. If we isolated and looked specifically at the utilization of the goods themselves, we see that the most dominant uses were water, medicinal plants, and fuel wood, while the least utilized goods were for thatch and clay. In terms of the environmental services, 22% of respondents had said that the the surrounding biodiversity actually gives some form of water harvesting or natural fertilizers. In terms of the perceptions, 73% of respondents related the surrounding biodiversity as a sense of identity, thus showing a sense of cultural attachment and place attachment. And it does highlight that respondents do actually also not only derive a tangible benefit, but also an intangible benefit from the surrounding ecology. Other uses or perceptions that they had about the ecology was that it is a site that allows for community interaction, as well as a site to actually encourage or promote nature-based learning. In terms of the KwaZulu-Natal Sandstone Saltfeld, majority of the respondents were actually unaware of the existence of the KwaZulu-Natal Sandstone Saltfeld. Those who were aware, which comprised of 29%, 31% of them were able to relate it to a form of a grassland, with a comparable proportion of respondents, 51%, utilizing the KwaZulu-Natal Sandstone Saltfeld. If we just look at the goods and services that were utilized within the KZNSS, 44% were primarily to gather resources, 30% for agricultural use, and the lower amounts were for recreation and leisure and other domestic products or goods that they were able to make. In terms of conservation, 80% were unaware of the term, were unaware of the term conservation. And when we probed it again for isiZulu and isiXhosa alternatives, we found that the most popular words were ukugcina and ukuvikela. If we take these four words together, if we were to loosely translate them, they denote a sense of to protect, to keep, or to enhance. So we do see again that even though that they do not know the English or scientific terminology of conservation, they do, in a sense, have some sort of conceptualization of what conservation would entail. 30% of them were aware of the municipality's conservation program, but of those 30%, only 38% of them participated in the program. And surprisingly enough, when we asked in general whether they engage in any other participation, they were able to identify or relate their participation to other non-governmental organizations rather than the municipality. And this is kind of interesting because now we actually realize that for these communities, they see what the eThekwini municipality is doing and what other organizations are doing as a separate goal, rather than seeing that these two entities are actually trying to achieve almost similar goals. In terms of threats to biodiversity, respondents identified dumping and pollution as the biggest threats to biodiversity. And in conclusion, we see that a lack of awareness of the scientific terminology, be it for biodiversity or conservation, doesn't necessarily equate to a lack of conceptualization. What we saw with the utilization of ecosystem or environmental goods and services was that these were mainly based on human consumptive needs or utilitarian needs. And as stated earlier on, the threats to biodiversity were mainly identified as human activities rather than what we were expecting to be climate change. And the reason for this is because threats such as climate change, because they occur over a long period of time, it's very difficult for communities and people as a whole to actually observe any negative impacts of climate change. Thus, they were readily able to identify the threats as those that they experience on a daily basis. As a whole, we saw strong signs of dependence and conceptualization of biodiversity and conservation, but despite the ability to conceptualize biodiversity, levels of public engagement in conservation remain low. And this could be linked to the fact that community members themselves did identify and did agree that they do lack the scientific knowledge on biodiversity. And yet again, this could be part of the recommendations that we actually explore how to encourage more education programs that raise the level of awareness and understanding of the ecological importance of conservation. And hopefully, this might change levels of awareness and attitudes and actually encourage more community engagement and into these conservation practices. Thank you for your time.